This video continues our study of theological observations, central idea statements, and applications. We're ready now to move to developing applications. The reason for beginning with the CIT statement is we want to have a solid foundation of this concise, compressed, condensed, central idea of the text, and on the basis of that, to move forward with an application. I used to think that for an application, the only valid sort was to craft it in terms of actions to be performed, or actions to avoid doing. And then I came across some instruction that said, that's not the only kind of application that can really be helpful to us. We should think a little more broadly. So let me commend to you these two more. Values that one should prefer or dismiss, and truths to embrace. Any three of these, or any one of these three, can represent very helpful applications to be expressed based on a given passage. Some passages will lend themselves more to commissioning us into action. Other passages may lend themselves more to shaping our values, what we understand is important to do or what's important to avoid. Or certain passages may present to us a truth that may displace some falsehood we'd been believing in. And God says to us, hey, set your compass straight, get on true north. This is what you should realize is God's reality of your situation. As you see at the bottom, now we're leaving, or building on actually, the CIT, and so now it is time to use imperatives, to use should or ought statements, and to speak for ourselves, I or me, we, us, or second person statements, you. We encourage developing applications in two phases. The first requires the use of imagination. As we live with the text and we do our best to hear it, to feel it as the original audience did, whether it's the people of Israel as the prophets are delivering a sermon to them, or perhaps Jesus' audience, his disciples, or the crowds as they're hearing his teaching, or perhaps it's Timothy receiving one of Paul's letters, or the audience of Peter's letters. You get the idea. As we put ourselves in their seats, in their sandals, we want to imagine how the people in that era should have responded. What did the Holy Spirit hope they would do or value? Or what truths should they embrace? How would that have affected them? At this point, admittedly, it'll be somewhat general in scope. That is to say, our proposed application for the original audience will probably not be measurable. And that is something we're going to encourage for our modern era application. And that's where we come next. When we craft a modern era application, then we want to ask, what difference should this passage make for us today? I would encourage you to experiment with making specific and measurable applications. What determines a specific and measurable? After you've done it, it will be clear, it will be obvious to you that you did it. Whereas if it's just a cultivation of an attitude, it's hard to determine whether or not that happened. So put in some markers that by which you can be, in a sense, held accountable for it. Incidentally, for some reason, this seems to be the hardest thing for people to do, to make it specific and measurable. It's as though we shy away from it. I guess we're afraid of failing. I'm not exactly sure. But very few actually follow through on this. But I encourage you, it won't cost you anything. It's not like you're going to fail the course or not make it to heaven if you don't do it, but just try to, let's just say if you don't act on the application that you formulate. But please experiment with expressing applications specific enough that you can look back on it and a person who embraced it could see, did I do it or did I not? Let's go to Psalm 114, and once again, remind yourself what the CIT is. You have it before you. And then start with the original audience. Imagine yourself among the psalmist's audience, hearing that song being read or sung. What did the Holy Spirit hope they might do or value or believe in response? Pause the video and restart it after you've jotted down an idea or two. I wonder if you came up with something like this. As you settle into Canaan, remember that your greatest possession is God's presence in your community. Incidentally, the words that are underscored are done so just to acknowledge that now we're encouraged to use imperatives and to use second-person terms, not to say that these are the most important words in the passage. As you settle into Canaan, remember that the psalm began by saying, you know, God got us out of Egypt. And so there seems to be this anticipation that they're on the way into Canaan, to their permanent home zone. And it seems that the psalmist and the Holy Spirit inspiring the psalmist was hoping that people wouldn't lose sight of this very important truth. Although they would possess the land, a more important possession is God's presence, dwelling among them, making his sanctuary in Judah. Here's another possibility. Again, it's imaginary, right? But grounded in the passage, grounded in the CIT. Cultivate an attitude of reverence for God, based on his power and drawn by his compassion. The power, he shows up, the rocks shake, and the rivers flow backwards. Drawn by his compassion, he turns rocks to water, even flint into flowing water, which is of just profound need for people who are making their way through the wilderness. And so, respond to this with reverence for God, not just afraid of him, but because he is powerful and drawn by his compassion. Seems like this is something the Holy Spirit hoped that that audience would catch on to and internalize into their relationship with God. All right, how about applying this for a modern audience? Not Israel back in the time of when Psalm 114 was written, but can you bring yourself up to the modern audience? Think about your context. Think about believers that you walk with, or others. Maybe what you see here is not just for believers, but for people that don't know God yet, haven't yet come into his grace. What would he hope? What would the Holy Spirit hope a modern audience would do, value, or believe in response? Pause the video, jot down some ideas. All right. Again, I wish I could see what you jotted down. I wonder if you came up with something like this. Have you today ever experienced God's grace in a time of need, where God provided for you in a striking way, a singularly striking way? Here we're trying to recapture this idea of God providing water from a rock, God showing up in a striking way and causing the rocks to tremble. So if you have experienced God's grace in a time of need, if that's part of your own memory, just like this was for Israel, remembering these times when God led them out of Egypt and then provided miraculously in the wilderness, if so, go back to that memory. Don't lose track of it. Try to remember afresh, how did grandeur and grace mix? That is, shaking of the rocks and gracious provision of water. How did grace and grandeur mix in that moment? Can you see how they may have both been at work? Maybe you can't. But if you can, that would be a good fit for this psalm. And here then is a step to take of application. In order to not lose track of that important realization, that lesson, that encounter with God and the lessons that come from it, create a simple reminder. It might be as small as a little sticker to put on a mirror or on a refrigerator. It could be as large as composing a song or sketching out and making a painting. The idea is to have some external token, not that we're going to worship the token, but it will stand there and remind us, so that the next time we find ourselves in the wilderness and out of water, we will realize that in the past, God's grace came to us in staggering dimension. And hopefully that reminder will draw us, will let us remember that He drew us back to Himself then, and He draws us to Himself now in a time of need. So with this token, it can remind us to tremble with gratitude. Incidentally, look at that last bullet. If someone, in a sense, signs on, say, yeah, I'd like to experiment with the application you've proposed. Can you sense that they will be able to tell whether or not they've done it? It is specific and measurable. How? Well, particularly if we put in a time element, and that's good to do. And it doesn't show up here, but we could say over the next 7 days or sometime during the next month or whatever seems reasonable. Create the reminder. So then at the end of that period of time, on the 8th day or in the next month, a person could look back, either an accountability partner or just a note to self. Hey, did I do it? Did I experiment with that application? Did it or didn't do it? Will this make all the difference? In other words, does this creating a sticker or a poem or a painting, is that going to guarantee spiritual growth? No, but it's a simple way and a tangible way of seeking to take seriously what God is saying to us through a passage and doing something measurable that says, hey, I'm trying to respond to this and walk in it and ingrain it in my life. Well, let's look back where we've traveled. We began with location, boundaries of the text. Also, where is it in its larger context and implications? And then what does it say? Literary and historical observations. And then for interpretation, asking what does it mean with interpretive questions, theological observations, distilling the central idea of the text. And most recently then, application. What does it mean to me? First, imagining it for the original listeners, and then considering how we should respond to it today, if possible, in specific terms. This wraps up the 4 phases of exegesis.